Hello and welcome to Earthcast, a platform for discussions about bridging the resource gap between people and planet. I am Olivia Taylor, or Olivia Earth on the socials, your host, and I will be interviewing a series of change makers, thinkers and disruptors, and asking them about their areas of expertise. Together, we will discover fresh perspectives and the most useful levers in society for change. The main question that we will explore is how are trade-offs made between people, planet and profit? More specifically, how do we solve wicked problems and make decisions at the margin? If you would like to hear more from Earthcast, subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media. Hello and welcome back. We are currently in June and it is one of my favourite months as we get to celebrate World Oceans Day, which is coming up next week on 8 June. So I thought it would be an interesting idea to speak to someone who specialises in freshwater. Today I'm speaking with Samir Randera-Rees, who is the Programme Manager for Water Source Areas at WWF South Africa, and has a Master's in Conservation Ecology and a Conservation Leadership MBA from the African Leadership University. He is also the founder and CEO of Whispers of the Wild and a former presenter on 50/50. Samir and the WWF team have helped to make the water source areas one of the country's highest conservation priorities and mobilised tens of millions of rands into these areas, which has gone towards empowering communal farmers, clearing thirsty alien trees, building youth capacity in the green economy, and starting green businesses. This work earned him recognition when he won the Mail and Guardian Greening the Future award. Samir's overarching approach to conservation is that it can only be effective with good scientific understanding of the systems that you are working in, as well as an understanding of the hearts, minds, and ambitions of the communities that interact with them. Having studied in both South Africa and in an emerged European market, what are some of the most useful lessons that you've brought back home to your work in South Africa? And are there any lessons that you've learned in South Africa that you think European countries could benefit from?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia, and thanks a lot for having me. It's interesting because the context, the emerged world versus the emerging world context is so utterly different. I remember, just to give you an example, in one of my first, when I arrived in Europe for my master's, one of my first courses was all about the importance of hedgerows for conservation in Europe, like the dividing lines that's just like one tree thick. And it kind of, at first I laughed and then I was utterly depressed that these tiny little areas had become like these refuges for wildlife in an utterly transformed landscape. And that's, when you think about that compared to what we've got in Africa, where we've got large areas of wilderness that are still relatively undeveloped and unspoiled, you start to realize that at least the environmental context is completely different. But then, of course, there's also the human context where you've got people that are largely living in the developed world where their needs are largely met, whereas in the developing world, there are still people that are struggling to live day to day. They're living under the poverty line. And that combination of those two things means that in many ways, you cannot compare the two contexts. And sometimes I would sit in class in Europe and just be utterly frustrated because I just felt like there was nothing that I was learning that was applicable to the African context. But I do think that there are some areas where there are learnings and there is some cross-pollination. I think that one thing that Europe needs to recognize is that, as their environment has degraded, we've seen that there's a shifting of the goalposts. And I think it's a generational thing that, their natural environment has degraded so long ago and each successive generation doesn't realize that their environmental experience, their experience of the natural environment is poorer than their previous generations and poorer than even more so than the generation before that, because you're only aware of your current context. And I think that that's a really important learning that we as Africans need to take heed of. And what Europe has managed to do is they've largely then managed to export their environmental impacts to the developing world, and we are kind of now footing the bill for the developed world's lifestyle, essentially, from an environmental perspective. But I think that we need to, it's really important to kind of take stock of where we are with every successive generation and tell the stories of what it was like to live in our generation, and make sure that we are kind of measuring against those baselines in terms of our quality of life, in terms of how we experience nature, in terms of the things that we are getting from nature, because Europe missed a bunch of that. So their baseline is a largely destroyed environment, and that's what they know, and they are kind of rebuilding from there. So I think that that's an important distinction to make. There is also there's some major differences between how we approach the environmental context. You know, Europeans and people from the emerged world generally have a bit more of an idealistic view. You know, and that's because they come from a point of luxury. They come from a point where their needs are met. They are looking at the third world as a place where they can protect nature and protect nature intact, because they often don't have very much of their own nature to protect. And sometimes they can then put that above the context of the needs of Africans to develop, to realize their own ambitions, to have dignity. If there's one thing that I think that Europeans can learn, is that you have to take the local context into account, and you have to respect the views of the people on the ground that know the context better than they would, living far away and having the luxury of being able to put food on their table. Yeah, I think that there's a lot more that I could say, but I think one of the major things that I think we as Africans can learn from Europeans is, I think that governance is so important, and Europe and the developing world has generally got that right. And what goes along with that is trust and civic mindedness. And we in Africa, we often implement certain projects, and maybe we try to develop some sort of governance systems, but often the actors within those governance systems lack trust between themselves. Often the governance systems are just not there, and there's not enough attention paid to building up those governance systems. And I think that if there's one thing that I think that we as Africans can learn, is about building governance and embedding our conservation and our sustainability approaches within those governance systems.
I really enjoyed how you spoke about understanding a local context, particularly from a European view, doing work in, in an emerging market. And I think it's always so important to take that, to really take stakeholder engagement into account. So thank you for going into that. And then just further on the same topic, are there any communication barriers between emerging and emerged markets in achieving specifically your conservation goals that you see in your work?
Yeah, I think there's a few. I think, as I said, the emerging world often takes an idealistic view and doesn't necessarily look at the on the ground context and the context of the people that live in those landscapes when they think about the actions that Africans and people in the emerging world should take. And the example that I like to point to is rhino poaching. Obviously, we know that rhino poaching in South Africa in particular, but across Africa was at least at one point at a crisis stage. And what always used to frustrate me is that I would go onto these forums, whether it was articles or Facebook or whatever, and I would read the comments whenever there was something about rhino poaching. And you would always see comments from people living in America, in Europe, people that were living in sort of middle to upper class backgrounds in Africa itself. And their response was always, kill them, kill the poachers, and that to me is so tone deaf that in most countries, we don't even have the death penalty for killing people, but there is this belief that it is reasonable and appropriate to kill Africans for hunting rhinos. These are people, and that completely ignores the context that people don't have money, they don't have food, they aren't able to feed their children, and there's often desperation involved in these actions. And do I believe that people should be killed for killing an animal like that? Absolutely not. I think that kind of view is abhorrent, and I think that people in the emerging world need to really try to put themselves in the shoes of people living in Africa or in emerging countries before they make comments like this. In many contexts, particularly in conservation, that there's often a little bit of an arrogance when it comes to people with money from the emerged world coming up with ideas for how people in the emerging world should protect their environment. That although they may not speak English as well as them, have a lot more lived experience, a lot more experience working with people on the ground. And I think that, just to repeat, you really need to understand the context and the people in order to create effective conservation solutions. And I think that sometimes people from the developed world can miss that.
Thanks again. Some of these nuances are often missed, and I really appreciate you bringing these up. And, I want to go back a little bit. I explained in the intro what you do, but from you, why water? And particularly, why fresh water? Why is this what you're interested in? And then, I'm going to ask you later, so let me just add this in now, because I know you're going to want to segue into this, but what are some of the more nuanced and indirect links between fresh water, the economy, food, and energy security? Because, I've got to know.
Why fresh water? To be honest, I never really saw myself working in fresh water. It wasn't a planned thing. It was more serendipity. I come from a background of conservation ecology. I did my master's looking at the interaction between large carnivores, and water hadn't really featured on my radar. But through, I finished my master's, I started my business. I ran for a few years. I started a business called Whispers of the Wild. That didn't really work out. Well, clearly I'm not doing that anymore, so it clearly didn't work out. But I then decided to transition from an entrepreneur into the sort of more formal conservation space. And it's a difficult transition to make. I'm sure most conservationists will attest that it's hard to get your foot in the door in conservation. And I was at the point where I was just like, okay, whatever opportunity presents itself, I'm just going to try and get my foot in the door, add value wherever I can. And WWF said that they needed a person to kind of volunteer and manage a project up in the mountains, in the Outeniqua Mountains. But it was a freshwater project. And I did that. And I developed great relationships with the people in the team. And then, again, serendipitously, someone in that team left and there was an opening. And although I was completely ill-equipped to do the job, I sort of put my hand up and said, okay, I think I'm willing to do this. And because I had developed those good relationships and kind of proved myself to the team, I got the job. And at first I was like a rabbit in the headlights. And then maybe a few months to a year, I kind of found my feet. I had to learn a whole new lexicon, learn a whole new field of water. But in the process, I realized that water is incredibly interesting and is probably one of the most influential spaces to be in without being at the front and center of everything. Because water is this incredible connecting force that somehow links everything in the environment, everything in society. Everything has a water footprint. And working in the water sector means that I can go and I can talk to people in business. I can go and talk to politicians. I can go to talk to people living in rural areas or people living in urban areas. I can talk to conservationists. I can talk to anyone. And intrinsically, they understand the value of water. And it's as someone who loves to communicate and to kind of adapt my message to my audience, it does provide the most incredible platform to build off, because I can always bring it back to how important water is, and people will understand that message. And then, yeah, I think to talk to your second question about, the nuances between fresh water and the economy and food and energy, I think that those interconnections, they, by nature, they demand a systemic approach. They demand that you don't just look at the water in the river or the water in the dam or the water under the ground. You can't do that, because if you have to look above, you have to look at it, as a connection between the land and the water. What happens on the land? Obviously, there's the natural environment and the ecological infrastructure that impacts the water. But then, of course, there's the human environments that impact on the land and the water in a million different ways. And, water takes this journey where it passes between the natural environment, the built environment. It's used in a million different ways. And I think that demands that you need to take a very holistic view of the system. You can't just look at one individual activity or one individual impact. And that means that, and that means that actually, in many ways, we often think about the world in the wrong context. I think that if we were honest with ourselves, the most appropriate sort of the most appropriate way to divide up the world is by looking at it through the lens of water. Rather than political barriers, rather than economic barriers and borders, I think that water barriers and water borders are some of the most sort of effective ways of looking at the landscape. And that often looks at the catchment, a river catchment. We all live within a river catchment. And whatever happens in that river catchment, somehow we are connected to all the people in that catchment, and that is through water. So if I had my way, I would use the river catchment as the most appropriate unit of planning in society. And then when you start to look at that context of the river, you start to realize that there are trade-offs between food security, energy security, economic security, and water is something that links all of these things. And I guess, to give you an example, let's look at I work in the Sabi River catchment, which is in Mpumalanga. And this catchment, it starts off in the mountains just outside the Kruger National Park. And up in the mountains, you have a lot of forestry and commercial agriculture. Then the river flows down and it turns into a sort of peri-urban sprawl around Hazy View sort of area until it reaches the Kruger National Park. It flows through the Kruger National Park and into Mozambique, where it gets dammed and where it's one of the main sources one of the sources of water for Maputo. So it takes this incredible journey down where it's an international river. It links one of the most iconic national parks with communities living outside them, with the food systems. And then when you start to think, like, there are decisions being made in that context. For example, there are mining licenses that are being given to people up at the top of the catchment. These mines are the types of mines that pose a serious threat to water resources. Then you start to say, okay, well, is that a rational decision? If you look at it just as the mine, okay, maybe it's a mineral that we need. It might be able to produce economic value. It might be able to produce jobs. But in the context of the catchment, it's going to potentially affect the farming community because of the water quality. It's a catchment in which water resources are already tight and they're getting tighter because of climate change. It's also a catchment in which people still live without proper water access, and this mine is going to be using a lot of water. Is it a reasonable thing to say that this mine can use a lot of water when it could potentially threaten the agricultural community, when it could potentially take away water from people that still need to get access to water? And again, if it pollutes the water, it could potentially affect the Kruger National Park, which is the largest supplier of jobs and economic value in the landscape. And of course, then it could potentially become a diplomatic issue between South Africa and Mozambique. So I believe that is one of the most interesting and effective ways of looking at a landscape, is to look at it within the context of a catchment. And yeah, I think that when you take the catchment and you take the kind of food, energy, water nexus, and you start to look at them in terms of trade-offs and synergies that can be found between these different nexes or these different pillars, you have to start to ask yourself, okay, in this context, where is the greatest scarcity and where is the greatest risk? And that should start to forge how you make your decisions. So in the South African context, again, I mean, we can look at the Sabi River context as an example. You've got enough energy in the catchment. You know, there's a lot of coal in that area. There's a lot of sunlight in that area. There's a lot of potential energy. It produces a lot of food. So even though there is food insecurity at an individual level, from a landscape scale, it is able to produce enough food to feed everyone, but it is highly water scarce. Therefore, when you look at the trade-offs that you need to make, you should be making decisions that maximize on water rather than on energy or on food. And obviously that context will change wherever you go. But I think that it's a very useful way of assessing a landscape and making decisions.
You know, you touched on human dignity earlier, and I wanted to know specifically, what are some of the levers that we can pull, you know, economic, social, others, in relation to water, in order to achieve high impact projects that don't shy away from the complexities of human dignity and environmental degradation, and actually embrace innovative ideas and technology, particularly in emerging markets?
Yeah, I think that we as conservationists, and often just in general, when we think about strategies to develop economies, and I think that we often fundamentally do not work from a point of deep understanding of the people in the landscape, of the cultures that are there, of the ambitions, the economies, the flows of resources. I think we often come in, we might see an individual problem or something that we're trying to solve, and try to solve that problem and kind of come from the outside and apply that solution to the landscape without necessarily delving deep into what it is that the people on the ground really need. And in the process, I think that we often miss opportunities and we often undermine our potential solutions. So let me give you an example from my work. I work in this area around a town called Matatiele in the Eastern Cape. It's a beautiful area in the foothills of the Drakensberg. Very poor, very rural, very isolated from the rest of the country. But it's an area that is largely dependent on livestock farming, traditional livestock farming, because it's all communal land. And in this area, you know, there were a few organizations that were working in this area, and they were trying to solve for the problem of erosion. It's a highly erodible landscape, and the whole area was being eroded, which was affecting the water quality. It was affecting potential developments on those rivers, because if there's erosion, it means there's silt in the water, which means that any dams will fill up with silt in no time at all. So they went upstream and they said, okay, what's causing the erosion? Overgrazing by the farmers. Okay, now we've got a problem to solve. Let's solve the problem of overgrazing. So they started to develop tools for farmers to employ for sustainable agricultural practices and sustainable grazing practices. And then they started to say, okay, well, wait, but you need to embed this into some sort of governance system, which is what I spoke about earlier. So they started to work with the grazing associations, which were traditional governance systems for managing the rangelands. And they got pretty far in terms of, you know, making people aware of ways in which they could reduce the erosion. But there was still something missing, and that was an incentive for these people to actually implement these activities. And then they started to, having been there for a while, they started to understand the needs of the people. And what they really realized was that actually access to markets was what people really needed, because they had these cows, and when they needed to sell them, they either had to walk 3 days to the nearest town to sell them, by which time their cattle were all skinny and they got bad prices, or they had to sell it to the nearest neighbor who didn't have money and they just had to settle for whatever price that person was willing to pay. And so there was a disconnect between the quality of the cattle and what they were able to earn for it. So then they said, okay, well, how do we connect people to markets, and how do we incentivize people to actually, through that connection, to actually employ better rangeland management practices? So they developed a business model called Meat Naturally, where they actually go and they find buyers of cattle from the nearest towns, and they take them up to these very rural areas, and they have mobile cattle auctions. So now someone can just go to their nearest field, take their cows over and sell them for a good market value. But the real key was that they said, if you are part of a grazing association, and if you are able to prove that you are implementing these best practices around rangeland management, then you pay a lower commission at the auction. And that was an incredible, it was the key that unlocked a whole lot of better behavior from, it was the incentive that people needed to implement these activities. So suddenly people were saying, okay, cool, where do I sign up for this grazing association? What do I need to do? Oh, we need to put this land aside to be rested. Okay, no problem. Then, because it means that when the auction comes, that's a few $100 in my pocket. And then that started to spread, because the next community along said, hey, we want access to the auctions too. What do we need to do? Oh, we need to start a grazing association and implement these activities. Cool, let's do it. So it led to proliferation across the landscape and an improvement in the behaviors and the attitudes, and ultimately the environmental outcomes. So I think that example is a good indication of that. When you understand the people and their needs, you can find the solutions that work for everyone, for your own needs and for the people that live in that area.
And when you're doing this kind of work, are there any particular gray areas that you struggle in, particularly with the trade-offs that you have to make? And when you think about solving these more complex issues, are you guided by a metric or by a gut feeling? Is there a specific metric that you choose to use?
It's a hard one. I think, the profit incentive is something that a lot of conservationists are playing with right now as a way of incentivizing sustainability, incentivizing conservation, and in many ways, it holds a lot of potential and a lot of promise. But that profit incentive it's a very fickle beast, and it can be quite unpredictable, because once it's out there and it's kind of out in the world, it can often take on new forms that you hadn't necessarily predicted, and it can create perverse incentives as at the same time. So I think that when we think about, the profit incentive, when we think about the trade-offs that you have to make, you also have to think very carefully. And sometimes it's in these things, but you have to try and put in fail-safes to try and prevent those perverse incentives becoming a reality. So one example I can give you is invasive alien trees in South Africa. Now, they are a huge problem. They are running rampant across our country. They are largely taking over the grassland and the fynbos ecosystems, which are obviously, as ecosystems, they're fairly low ecosystems. And we've got big trees coming and growing over the top of these small bushes and grasses, crowding them out. And these trees use a lot more water than the natural environment. So it's a problem from a biodiversity perspective. It's a problem from a water perspective. And it's a problem from a sort of human and social perspective, because people often rely on that water and they rely on the grasses to feed their cattle and various other things. So we've been playing with this idea. There's big programs that have been going on for decades to cut down these alien trees, but despite that, we've been losing the battle. For every hectare that we cut down, there's probably one that gets reinvaded somewhere. So we're seeing that we're not winning the battle, and we're starting to think, okay, how do you create an incentive for people to clear themselves? And that says, okay, these trees that we're cutting down, they have value. They can be turned into all sorts of products, whether that's charcoal or wood or activated carbon or a whole range of things. How do we start to unlock that value? But the thing is, you can't just chop down a tree and then leave and it'll never grow back. These trees they coppice, they come back, there's seed banks that need to be taken care of. Once you chop them down, they need to be you need to go back and make sure that the regrowth is controlled. So the thing that people are really scared of is creating a perverse incentive to say, you cut down a tree, you give people incentive to cut down a tree, but not to do all of the necessary management to make sure that those trees never come back. And actually, you might be creating an incentive for people to grow trees rather than to actually cut them down. So that's a struggle that many people have been unwilling to take on. But what we've done with some of our partners is we've brought in the Forestry Stewardship Council to certify these areas. And that certification process goes along with a whole lot of environmental and social management systems that need to be in place. But the incentive is that if you are certified, then you get access to the highly lucrative European market for your products, whether those products are charcoal or activated carbon or wood. You can then start to export them and get a lot more money from from the products that you're producing. But the catch is that you have to be compliant. And that's it's still early days, but we're hoping that this is going to start to solve some of those problems and some of those trade-offs. I think that's just one example, but I think that's where some of the hardest trade-offs come in the space, where there is a trade-off between environmental conservation on the one hand and human development and human needs on the other hand. And as much as we would love to find win-win situations where we can, that's not always possible. Ultimately, it comes down to between pragmatism versus idealism. There are many conservationists that are very idealistic and will say, I will only do this under these circumstances, and I won't do anything that has any sort of impact on the environment. Whereas as more of a pragmatist, I kind of take the approach that says I need to take a bigger picture view and say, is it worth allowing sort of small environmental impacts at a localized scale for the sake of larger environmental benefits? And yeah, as I say, I'm more of a pragmatist in my approach, and I tend to say, let's try and achieve the greatest environmental benefit as a whole. And if that means having some sort of small impact, then so be it. And yeah, I mean, I think you asked, okay, how do I make decisions and what sort of metrics do I use? I mean, it would be lovely to be able to make decisions based on sound science and good data, but so often in the context that we work, we don't have that data and available to you. So when you're making a decision, it's not gut feel, but you have to base it on whatever information is available to you. And sometimes that information is kind of theories of change, or anecdotes that you've heard from local people, or informed opinions of experts, or if there's some sort of analogous research that you can find. It all factors in to your decision-making process, and you have to kind of be aware of all of these inputs and take them into account and make decisions like that. And if there is good data, then of course you integrate that in, but that can't be the only thing that you base your decisions on.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I often found that in some of the work that I've done as well, it's been very difficult to apply best practice through traditional metrics, as you spoke about earlier, with this perhaps naive and limited view that European investors have, and the demands that they have with compliance on emerging companies. But I wanted to go a bit further. What are some of the biggest issues that are keeping you up at night, and what are the solutions, even if just idealistic, despite being a pragmatist, that you're toying with?
If all the environmental issues in the world kept me up at night, I would never sleep. So, so luckily I sleep okay, despite all the things that play on my mind about the environment. But I guess some of those things, I think one of the things that worries me the most is the erosion of trust in science. I mean, we've seen through some of the political leaders that we've seen coming through, whether it's Trump or Bolsonaro, you see that there are political movements that are trying to undermine the faith in scientific information. You know, there's no way that climate change should be a partisan issue. Like, the information is there. It's unequivocal. There is good science backing it up. We know that we are causing climate change, and that climate change is going to have enormous impacts on the world. That shouldn't be in question. It's just maybe there should be questions about how we address it. But we've got political movements that are now, you know, they're starting to dismiss these systems that have been that are millennia old, and they're saying, you know, that the information that they come up with is not to be trusted, and that then puts us on. We can't have an equal conversation then. We can't say, oh, here's the information to prove our point of view. Because if someone is saying, yeah, but where did that information come from? It came from scientists, and the scientists are not to be trusted. That is, you know, suddenly we're fundamentally playing on different fields. And that is a really scary thing for me. And as far as solutions to that, I don't really have a solution to that, unfortunately. I think that these are powers that are far beyond my own my own influence. But I think at a more localized level, what often keeps me up at night is not necessarily an environmental issue. It's the fact that so much of what we try to do, whether it's in conservation or development, so much of it is undermined by issues of safety and security and of trust. I find that whenever we go into a landscape and we try to do something, no matter how well intentioned, there are always people that are going to steal things, or there is going to be violence against some of the people that we work with, or there's so many issues, social issues, that are so fundamental in many of these communities that I mean, it's so hard to address them. But I think that it's often not even, we often don't even talk about it. We often don't talk about that crime and safety and security and corruption and so many of these things are poverty traps, and they are causing environmental destruction in such a systemic and fundamental way that no matter what we try to do, it's going to undermine everything that we try to do. And again, it's a question of, you know, it's not necessarily a question that I have a solution for. I think that the issues that keep me up at night are the ones that I don't have solutions for. And yeah, that's why they keep me up at night.
I actually completely agree with you on this one. I think the things that we have clarity on are definitely not the ones that keep us up at night. Perhaps that needs a rephrase. But yeah, who have you met or worked with or interviewed recently that is particularly interesting ideas in your industry?
Yeah, I think very tragically, one of South Africa's most eminent scientists, Professor Bob Scholes, recently passed away. And I've been looking at, I had a lecture with him a few months ago, and in the aftermath of his passing, I've been reading articles about him and watching videos from him. And, you know, I think he was a unique thinker. He was one of the world's top scientists, and he was a systems ecologist. And in the same way that I was saying about how water interacts with all these systems, he saw the world as systems and interconnected systems, human ecological systems. And he had amazing ways of drawing the connections between political systems and financial systems and the marketing machines out there, and some of our ecological systems. And he sort of started to unravel how if you trace the impacts of in our natural environments, if you trace them up and you look at where they come from, they often come from faults in our human systems. And his solutions came from this very sort of holistic systems approach, which I thought was very interesting and very inspiring, actually.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate that. I've heard you say before in conversation that to be effective, we must take an interest in understanding the relationships of the hearts, minds, and ambitions of affected communities. And, we've spoken about stakeholders earlier. So I'd really love you to really get into what you mean by this and perhaps explain in a practical way how we could achieve this. What is something that you would like more people to know about the interconnectedness of these different themes?
One thing that I've really learned is that you can't do anything without trust. I've had projects in very similar situations, very similar contexts. One where there was a lot of trust between the people implementing the project and the communities, and one where there probably wasn't. And you see that trust is absolutely fundamental to the success of a project. And it's not just trust between people implementing and the communities, but also the trust within communities, because something that I've become very aware of is that, particularly in Africa, trust has been eroded over generations, whether it's through slavery or colonialism or apartheid, or trust between people and the system, between each other. It's been eroded. And when you don't have trust, you can't build the governance systems, as I spoke about before. You can't get people to collaborate effectively for any length of time, because ultimately, once you might start off with collaboration, but then that mistrust will bring infighting, it'll bring backstabbing, it'll bring all sorts of things. And then it'll cause the project to collapse, and all the benefits that went along with it will be lost. And I've seen amazing examples where people have invested a lot of time and a lot of energy into building that trust as a foundational approach to anything they do in the landscape and with any sort of community. You cannot do without it. But for me, the question then is, are we missing the point? Because often we think about this as a side issue. Okay, yeah, we need to build trust, but we don't put it central to our approach. And how do we? I mean, there's quite a few big questions for me. What does that look like? What does it look like to take trust building and put it at the center of everything that we do? Trust building between the institutions, building the people, and how do you accelerate that process? Because the traditional wisdom is that trust takes years and years to build, and there's no substitute for time. And I think maybe that is true, but I think that there are ways of accelerating the process of trust building. I think that's the concept of going away. If you think of in your business, you often take people on excursions or team building exercises, because it's in those sort of very intensive situations where trust is built more rapidly. But what does that look like at a sort of community level? What does that look like at a societal level? How do you build trust? And how do you do that when you're not the government, when you are an NGO or a business? How do you build trust? And I think that there's a lot of areas where you can start to draw on fields of research and experiences. Social media is one area where you see that trust is what they're doing. They have whole teams of people that are dedicated purely to the attainment or purely to building trust with their users. And, can we start to take some of those learnings and start to apply them into the landscapes where we work? But at the same time, I think that it can be a bit of a slippery slope. You don't want to get to the point where you're looking at social engineering or propaganda or something like that. How do you do it so that you respect the people and you don't manipulate them, you're not dishonest with them? And I think that there's a lot of different fields that you can start to draw on to start to answer these questions. Social learning is one tool that we use a lot. That's about making people learn from each other, and creating the spaces and the environments in which people are able to learn from each other. I think that there's a lot of work in the fields of behavioral economics and social sciences, in marketing, in design thinking, that we as conservationists, we need to start to gather those pieces of information, these approaches, and create a much more holistic approach to conservation that just simply says we are trying to solve environmental problems and we are scientists, that therefore we know how to do it. And I think that sometimes it means that we need to, in many ways, change the way that we fund this work, because so often funding goes towards a log frame and standardized outputs that are decided before the project has even started. We say, this is what we're trying to achieve, X, Y, and Z. But I think we need to start to be much more adaptive in the way that we design projects, and the way that we, and as funders, they need to look at it in such a way to say, how do we unearth these opportunities? How do we use the information from the ground and from the people living in those areas to adapt our approach and to respond to emerging opportunities? And I think that for me is where we as conservationists need to start thinking.
It was such a lovely answer. I really enjoyed listening to that. Thank you. There's a synergy with passing the mic and empowering, somewhere lying in there, which is sort of along the lines of some of the thinking I've been seeing thrown around recently, especially with young activists in the sort of climate space. But we're coming to the end of our time together and the podcast. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time and your consideration spent with me today, and really thinking about these questions. And just for people who are listening today, if you'd like to connect or perhaps follow more of the work that Samir is doing, you can do that either on Instagram at SAMIRRR_photography, or through the WWF website. So for the last question, given your change in career from an ecologist by training to an entrepreneur, to having completed a Conservation Leadership MBA, your work with WWF, and your expertise in applying entrepreneurial approaches to protecting the environment, what question should I have asked you?
Perhaps the question that I believe you could have asked is, what are the competencies that we need to be building in conservation, in the conservation field, and in the education systems that feed the conservation field, in order to achieve a more effective form of conservation? And yeah, I think that obviously I'm a bit of a generalist, so maybe I'm biased in this because I've had exposure to economics, and I've done an MBA, and I've been an entrepreneur, and now I'm a conservationist. But in all of that, I think the fact that I have sort of touched on a lot of different things has really benefited me, because conservationists so often come from a scientific background. They are ecologists and they're biologists and they are various other things like that. But when you become a conservationist, a practitioner, I don't spend my days out in fields collecting samples or in laboratories or whatever. There are specialist scientists that do that. But as a conservationist practitioner, I found that I'm far more involved in politics and economics and financing and project management and social sciences and communications and a whole range of different things that I was never exposed to in my conservation training. And I think that conservation needs to start thinking differently in quite a fundamental way. It needs to start thinking differently about itself, because conservationists can't think of themselves as just pure scientists anymore. They need to start to think of themselves as, because of these interconnected systems, they need to start thinking of themselves as multi-pronged, multi-skilled people and organizations. conservation organizations need to either start to integrate the different forms of skills into their organizations, so whether that's social scientists or economists or whatever it is, or they need to start forging much stronger relationships with the organizations that do these things. And then when they think about solving conservation issues, they need to make sure that those other expertise are in the room when the solutions are being developed. And as a young conservationist, a conservationist in training, I would say that you need to start to expose yourself to a whole range of different expertise. You need to start to learn to communicate. You need to expose yourself to economics, to design thinking, and most importantly, I think you need to start to take on an entrepreneurial mindset, because we as conservationists, if we're going to win this environmental war that's happening, if we're going to ensure that the environment has a space on this earth, we need to make sure that we are trying to advance the cause of the environment just as forcibly as the people that are following alternative motivations like the profit motive. And we need to make sure that we are entrepreneurial, we are creating new opportunities, that we are trying to find new ways of doing things and applying new innovations, because that's the only way that we're going to win. Because right now, unfortunately, we're losing the war.
Thank you for joining me today at Earthcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe to this podcast and leave a review. Let's chat next episode, where I will be asking more creatives and intellectual disruptors about making decisions at the margin. See you next time.